It's nice to be here again with Advocata, one of the groups that I happen to work with during my political exile, and therefore we'll find a lot of similarity in the thinking. I've asked Murtaza, in addition to organizing seminars, to start the economic dialogue, where the advisory committee on economic stabilization can share its view with a much larger community of people who are interested. The economic stabilization and reforms in Sri Lanka are of interest to many, many people. But it's not possible for everyone to be accommodated in an advisory committee. Nevertheless, they should not be excluded. And the economic dialogue, the network which we are starting, will reach out not only to economists and people in the business sector, but also to academics, and I hope later on to the smaller chambers and business associations at village level. So where do we start? First and foremost, well, I won't go through the history of what happened. I'm sure Harsha will do that, and it will save me some time to deal with what we have today. Because the task first is for Sri Lanka to stabilize its economy. How do we do that? This crisis that we face today is a crisis which I look back in history and I found that I did not see such a crisis during the British time or the Dutch time or the Portuguese time. And the Portuguese period was one of warfare. The only similar situation that I could come to was the collapse of the Rajarata economy, which led to the drift of civilization back here into the southwest. It was such proportion. It's hit us everywhere. And how do you go out of it? When the Thai crisis took place, it was called the Tom Yum Goong crisis. I don't know what we call this. Maybe a hodda. That's what we have finally become with our economics. Well, the way out is through the agreements that we have with the IMF. The staff level agreements, first and foremost. I don't think there's any other way out. People talk of alternative measures, but that has not worked. During the Asian crisis of 1997, it was IMF that came forward to look at the reforms. During the 2009 crisis, 8-9 crisis, it was again the IMF. Whether we like it or not, we have to deal with the IMF. This time IMF minus Stanley Fischer. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing is for each of you to decide. Then first and foremost, we have to enter into the standby agreement with the staff level agreement with IMF. Now this is an issue which the whole parliament has to consider. If any member of parliament or any party says we are not for it, then we have the right to ask, what is your solution? What is your alternative? Because all parties must abide by this agreement. When we are negotiating with the IMF, one of the biggest issues that we have to face is government changes and the policies change. So the first issue is not the substance, but are we prepared? Are we prepared to stand by to support this agreement? If you are not prepared, then the parliament must take the consequence. That is very clear. We can't say we are for half and not for the other half. You have to take the whole thing in full. So this is a matter which not only members of parliament, but people outside parliament must also bring their influence to bear on those who have to take decisions inside parliament. It may be bitter, But any medicine for recovery is bitter. You have to take injections. So we know the path we have to take. First, we have the staff level agreement. Secondly, and more important, is the sustainable debt. How are we to handle the sustainable debt? First, the foreign debt. And when you look at the official debt, are we getting caught into the geopolitics of the region, of Asia? That's the first issue. Are we getting caught into the geopolitics, or can we navigate our way? So until you settle the, come to an agreement among the official creditors, it is not possible to go to the London Club. Second, and the more important issue is, have we got to look at the local debt? Now that has far-reaching consequences. The Lazards, the financial advisors, are looking at both debts. So remember, the first part, we have to look at both the foreign debt and the local debt. It's certainly going to be a difficult time. I won't say no. The first 6 months will be difficult. It will be a period which we have not seen before. But we all have to go through it. If anyone has a formula, proposals that will make it easier, certainly, I think we should hear it, and the Parliament could then decide between these two sets of proposals. Otherwise, we have no other way except to bite the bullet. So how do we prepare ourselves? And in doing so, before we get on to the recovery, is the very important issue of the social, economic dimensions of the crisis. We have over 6 million people who are being malnourished. More and more are being unemployed. How long will it last? And how are we going to support them? We are setting aside some additional money from the government, but you will find demands in companies that are doing well for some form of allowance or a salary increase. But to implement these reforms, to implement the restructuring, you need stability. So we have to look at the social and the economic dimensions of the reforms, the restructuring that we are going to implement. We have already seen the economic impact of the shortage of fuel and inflation in this country. Impact which came on to the political scene and the social scene. It's only now that we are restoring or we are getting back to a stable system of government. We cannot have a second incident. I don't know whether we can stand that strain. So while looking at the economics of it, look at the social side of it. Look at the well-being of a large number of people who will be affected by this crisis. We cannot look at it merely in terms of figures. We have to look at it in terms of persons involved. So this is, to me, the most important part of the restructuring. How are the people affected? How are you going to cushion it? Even with the IMF, there's agreement that the vulnerable groups have to be looked after. But we have to find the resources. It's easier said than done. We've got to target them. And that is a task which I would like the whole of the community to be involved. Yesterday, I happened to meet the Mahanayaka of the Amarapura sect, and the Mahanayaka and the senior priests all agreed with us that even the temples can be used for community kitchens. So in different ways, I want all of you to step forward to help those who are unfortunate. Because we have to remember the other side of it. the gap between the haves and the have-nots are increasing. It has not decreased in the last 10 years, 15 years. It has increased. The disadvantaged groups are being pushed aside or being pushed back, and that's getting affected. It is one of the main characteristics of the Aragalaya. And thirdly, the main instrument for social mobility, education. School education has not functioned for the last 2-3 years. We've closed down because of COVID. We couldn't function because of the shortage of fuel. And the main instrument of upward social mobility is now broken. How do we restore it? How do we ensure that we can reduce the gap between the haves and the have-not? So this also means that we will have to have higher taxation, even taxation on wealth. We have to resort to those measures, first for economic recovery and second for social stability. So in any plan for recovery, we have to keep this in mind. Then we go on to the next step. Just as much as you stabilize the economy, you must have fast recovery. As the next speaker will tell you, Thailand was able to have a quick recovery. What was happened in 1997, by 1999 was growing, and by 2001 or 2, they had got themselves out. So we have to take a path that will give us a quick recovery. We can't go back to the old economy. We can't go back to that model. I was one of those who were involved in 1977 in creating that open market economy. But we did not keep up with the changes. We did not keep up with globalization. And today we are paying the price. So there's no need now for us to go back to the same system and get stuck with it again. Let's think anew. If all this has been destroyed, there is no need to rebuild on the old plan. Remember, we are also a country which will have to pay off a high debt burden. Remember that. So we've been thinking in terms of a highly competitive export-oriented economy. How do we get there? First and foremost, the time that we are stabilizing also is the time for reform, to change the laws, to change the systems, to change the institutions. The 6 months to 1 year, I think till about July next year, we will have to go through a hard time. That's also the time for planning and the time for opening up. Let us look at new sectors. One I believe very much is logistics. If you see the growth of the Indian, Bangladeshi and the Pakistan economies, logistics can have a big role to play here in Colombo, in Hambantota and in Trincomalee. This is how we use our strategic position. So logistics is something new. Second is renewable energy. Look at the renewable energy we have in this country. Look at green hydrogen, green ammonia. The sale of power to India. I think we have to seriously consider. I don't know whether the two members of parliament in front of me will agree. We have to seriously consider getting a report on the use of nuclear energy in Sri Lanka. More energy you have, more energy you can sell to India. At the same time, keep more renewable energy available here. We have to think out of the box. Some are going to criticize me for the idea I have put forward. On whether we have to survive as a nation. We have to become a middle income economy and then to a high income economy. So these are two areas. Modernize our agriculture. We must modernize agriculture. Otherwise, agriculture will not survive in our country. Modernize our fisheries. Look at the new. Look at niche markets. Look at the new technology in manufacturing, the fourth industrial revolution, and of course, it must be an economy that will mitigate climate change. That is essential. We have to go ahead. There are other concerns to be looked at. There will be a demand that we meet the goals of sustainable development. We have to look also at the issue of women, who are half the population of this country, more than half, and their status. It's well known because when I look around here, I see a few women in the hall. If I went to somewhere in the West, there have been far more. So these are some aspects. Social mobility. This will require a new system of education, more people in technology. How do you get that system of education going when there's a ceiling on your spending? The ownership of land, I must say, all those issues are covered by this seminar. So I will not deal with it at length, except to say that we need a social market economy today. Just as much as we must make money and make bigger profits, there must be more money available to people. The housing needs must be met in the next 15, 20 years. We have to meet that. Poverty should no longer be existent in the rural areas of Sri Lanka, or for that matter, the urban areas. We are a small country. We can go ahead. Remember, we are talking of a highly competitive economy. A highly competitive economy does not run on low wages. A highly competitive economy runs on high wages and a high productivity. Both those are necessary. Without those, we can't go ahead. Then we come to another issue of trade integration in the region. Unfortunately, I don't think you will see trade integration in the South Asian region. No. There will have to be bilateral agreements with whoever we want. There's too much of politics involved for there to be a regional trade agreement in South Asia. So we can keep that aside. We can have integration in dancing, we can have integration in cooking, but certainly are not going to have integration as far as the economy is concerned. Where do we go? We have to look at the ASEAN and the RCEP. Have bilateral agreements with some other countries, but also agreements with ASEAN and with RCEP. That's a growing market, it's a big market, and the income levels are much higher. So let's look at it. Later on, you can look at Africa, East Africa especially. We must keep our economic relationships with Europe, and we have a UK that is looking for a role as the global Britain. So I think Sri Lanka can easily get closer and have a better relationship with UK. And then we get on to the US itself. US economy is also undergoing changes, and I think that will benefit us. But we have to remember one thing. Remember, the global situation next year is not going to be favorable to anyone. Let's hope 2024 will be better. But we have to get through all this. We have to find niche markets. We have to find the people. So all I can say to you, I think since, as I told you earlier, dealing with the issues, is are you ready to take up the challenge? Are you ready to influence other people to take up the challenge? Or are you going to sit back? Many people may not like to hear this, but in 1977 we wanted change. And when the government came, we made the changes. Few of us went into politics, others are not in politics. Some did some work and went back into business. Others stayed on in cooperation. Nevertheless, we made that change. Unfortunately, we could not take it forward. That is what happened. So now we need the change. In between came globalization and this view that greed is good. I don't think you can go anymore with greed is good. That era is over. You have to be competitive. But our institutions must work. There are a lot that can be done in restructuring the state enterprises. But where are we going to do the restructuring? What is the platform for restructuring? Many of you say send it to the stock exchange. I have my questions about it. The stock exchange is today identified not with the London Stock Exchange. There are many questions about the stock exchange. That a few people control it and a few people rig it. Now, can I put any state enterprise shares onto that to help a few people? Either you all must change or we put up a new institution. I don't want any more arguments on that. If we are to use the present stock exchange, we must all be satisfied that it is neutral and it will benefit all. Because this is a country in which all the people must benefit. All the people are suffering, especially the lower end, going to suffer the most. They must know that suffering has not been in vain. That has worked for the benefit. There has to be changes. There has to be rise in incomes. Workers have to be looked after. Good education facilities have to be made available. There is no going back to an old system. We are going to a new system. And that new system is what the young want. So then shape it yourself. Look at what you want. We are undertaking a review of all that we have done. We are undertaking, or we have given the Sadhana, Samaja and others the task of looking at reconstructing the future. What do you want? So let's get those views. But remember, the first item on the agenda is the economy. It may also be the second item on the agenda. But it's without doing the economy, we can't do anything else. So I don't want to take any more of your time. You have many interesting talks and discussions, and I wish you all